In 1963, when America still stayed awake after midnight, the bell above the diner door didn't ring at 4 a.m. It rattled, a cold metallic sound cutting through the silence. Then came the smell. Burnt coffee, grease, and bacon frying on a pan that hadn't been fully cleaned in days. A tired truck driver slid onto a stool after hours on the highway. No menu, no small talk. Just a nod from him, and coffee poured by a waitress who already knew his order. That was the real America, raw, sleepless, and alive, before neon drive-thrus replaced human connection forever. Number 25. Red-eye gravy and country ham. The cook poured black coffee directly into the hot pan where the ham had just fried. That was it. That was the gravy. Dark, bitter, thin as water, shot through with pork drippings. Truckers in the rural South soaked their biscuits in it at 4 a.m. and called it a meal. In Tennessee and Alabama diners in the 1940s, a full ham plate with red-eye gravy cost 18 cents. Today, a restaurant in Nashville calls it ham jus and charges $16. Grandma just called it not wasting the pan. Number 24. Cornmeal hotcakes, not pancakes. Do not call them pancakes. Denser, darker, the color of a dirt road after rain. Made with cornmeal, 1 egg, buttermilk, and nothing else. In Appalachian diners along Old Route 23 in the 1940s, a stack of 3 cost a nickel. A trucker eating at 4 a.m. needed fuel that lasted until noon, not something that dissolved in his stomach by 8. These held, they lasted, they worked. Today we call the same thing polenta cakes and charge $14 a plate. Number 23. Scrapple. Pork scraps, cornmeal, buckwheat flour, sage, black pepper, cooked down together, packed into a loaf, cooled overnight, sliced thick, and fried hard in lard until the outside went almost black. Pennsylvania Dutch diners along Route 30 served this every morning from the 1930s onward. A full slab with 2 eggs cost 12 cents. It was the ugliest thing on the plate and the best thing on the plate. Nobody argued about that. Nobody needed to. Number 22. Shit on a shingle. That was its name. Dried chipped beef, creamed in a white gravy, poured over white toast. World War II mess halls served it to millions of American men. Those men came home, walked into roadside diners, and ordered it by name. Waitresses didn't blink. Cooks didn't flinch. It meant something. It tasted like surviving. By the 1960s, it was disappearing from menus. Too rough, too honest, too much of a reminder of something the country wanted to forget. Number 21. Sawmill gravy and cathead biscuits. The biscuits were the size of a cat's head. That was not a description. That was the name. Lard-based, tall, cracked open by hand, never cut with a knife. Flour, whole milk, black pepper, cooked until a spoon could almost stand in it. In sawmill towns across the Ozarks and rural Tennessee in the 1930s and 1940s, this was not comfort food. This was infrastructure. A man who ate this at 4 a.m. could work until dark. Number 20. Fried salt pork and eggs. Before bacon became the undisputed king of the American breakfast table, there was salt pork. And it was not a substitute. It was not the lesser version of something better. It was its own thing entirely. Cured hard in brine for days, sometimes weeks, sliced thin against the grain, laid onto a flat top that had already been running hot for 2 hours. The edges curled first, then the surface blistered. Then the fat rendered clear and pooled in the pan, and that was where the eggs went, cracked directly into that fat, fried until the whites set and the yolk stayed soft. In truck stop diners across the Midwest and the Great Plains in the 1940s, salt pork cost a fraction of what bacon cost. Sometimes half the price per pound, sometimes less. Nobody was settling. The flavor was deeper. The salt penetration was complete in a way that modern bacon, injected with water, sliced thin at industrial speed, shrunk to half its size the moment it hit heat, will never replicate. The food industry didn't upgrade the American breakfast when they moved salt pork off the menu. They found something cheaper to produce at scale and spent 40 years of advertising teaching you to prefer it instead. Number 19. Liverwurst and onion hash. German Immigrant diner owners had been feeding working men since before the Depression. Along Old Route 40, through Dayton, Indianapolis, into the flat belly of Illinois, these diners operated out of converted houses and repurposed filling stations, and what came off their flat tops reflected where their owners had come from. Liverwurst and onion hash was one of those meals. Liverwurst sliced thick from the chub, diced into rough cubes, thrown onto the flat top with yesterday's boiled potatoes and half an onion, pressed down hard with the spatula, and left alone until the bottom layer went dark and the edges of the liverwurst crisped at the corners. A plate cost 15 cents in 1948. One serving delivered more iron than 3 portions of lean beef. More vitamin A than most men got in a week. The truckers who ordered it didn't know any of that. They didn't need to. They knew the road felt shorter after a plate of it. They knew they could drive through till noon without their hands shaking on the wheel. Grandma just called it hash. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 18. Savory oatmeal with pork drippings not sweet. Understand that first. Not maple syrup. Not brown sugar, not the little paper packet of dried fruit that comes in a box with a smiling Quaker on the front. Rolled oats, real ones, not instant, not quick cooking, boiled in salted water until thick, finished with a heavy spoonful of bacon drippings or lard stirred through until they melted in, sometimes a raw white onion diced fine and cooked into the oats in the last few minutes. In upper Midwest diners, Minnesota logging towns, Wisconsin Isendarians routes, the upper peninsula of Michigan where winter arrived in October and didn't leave until May. This was a Depression-era meal that never fully left the menu because it worked too well to abandon. A bowl cost 3 cents in 1938. It held a man for 4, 5, 6 hours on a cold road. The Quaker Oats Company spent the post-war decades repackaging oatmeal as a sweet breakfast food. Brown sugar flavors, apple cinnamon, maple, and honey. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. They didn't make oatmeal better. They made it smaller, sweeter, more dependent on their own added ingredients, and more profitable per serving. They took a 3-cent meal that lasted 6 hours and turned it into a 99-cent packet that wore off by 9. Number 17. Fried cornmeal mush. Made the night before, always the night before. That was not laziness, that was architecture. Cornmeal stirred into boiling, salted water and cooked down slow until it pulled away from the sides of the pot. Then poured into a greased loaf pan and left in the cold overnight. On the back porch in winter, in the icebox in summer, until it set firm enough to hold its shape when sliced. In the morning the cook pulled it out, cut it into slabs half an inch thick, and laid them onto a flat top running hot with lard. The outside formed a hard golden crust in 3 minutes. The inside stayed soft and steaming. You could hear it from across the diner, that specific hiss of cold mush hitting hot fat. Ohio River Valley diners in Kentucky and Indiana served this for 2 cents a serving through the 1930s and 1940s. With sorghum poured over it, it was complete. With an egg alongside it, it was a feast. Today we slice polenta, pan-fry it in olive oil, and charge $11 for 6 pieces at brunch restaurants in cities where nobody remembers what the original word for it was. Number 16. Diner hash. There was no recipe. There was never supposed to be a recipe. Whatever hadn't sold the night before, potatoes cut for home fries that didn't move, a scrape of roast beef from the lunch special, half an onion that had been sitting since yesterday afternoon, sometimes a green pepper if the cook had one, went onto the flat top together at 4 a.m., spread out into a wide layer, and got left completely alone. That was the secret, leaving it alone. Pressing it down once with the spatula and walking away for 4 minutes while it built a crust on the bottom. Then flipping it in sections, not stirring, never stirring, and pressing again. The crust on the second side formed faster because the fat was already worked into it. In upstate New York and across the New England truck routes of the 1950s and 1960s, this was called a garbage plate by the cooks and simply hash by everyone who ordered it. 2 eggs on top, runny, so the yolk broke over everything when you pushed your fork in. Hot sauce if the diner had it, nothing if it didn't. It tastes different every single morning because it was different every single morning. That was not a flaw in the system. That was the system working exactly as intended. Number 15, streak-o-lean and eggs not bacon, not fatback. Do not confuse it with either one. Streak-o-lean was a specific cut, a slab of pork with a thin ribbon of lean muscle running through a thick layer of white fat, the lean streak visible from the outside like a dark line drawn through marble. Fried correctly, the fat rendered almost completely clear, while the lean strip went dark at the edges and stayed dense and chewy at the center. It left a pan of drippings that were different from bacon drippings, richer, with more depth, because the proportion of fat to meat was different, and the cure was different, and the animal was different. Deep South diners in Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi served streak-o lean through the 1940s and into the 1960s. You cannot buy this cut in a grocery store today, not because the pig changed, because the meatpacking industry reorganized its standard cuts in the 1970s, and this one didn't survive the consolidation. The industry decided which parts of the animal Americans would have access to, and streak-o-lean was not on the approved list. They knew things about the pig that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. Number 14, cracklin' bread. Cornbread baked with pork cracklings folded directly into the batter before it went into the cast iron. Not crumbled on top, not stirred in gently. Folded in, rough pieces of rendered pork skin, still carrying residual fat, distributed through the raw batter so that as the bread baked and the cornmeal set around them, the remaining fat in each crackling rendered outward into the surrounding crumb. What came out of the oven was cornbread with crispy pockets of pork scattered through every bite. The fat had migrated. The crumb was richer for it. The crust was darker where the cracklings had touched it from the inside. In Louisiana, Arkansas, and East Texas diner counters of the 1930s and 1940s, this was not a side dish. A square of cracklin' bread with black coffee at 4 a.m. was a complete meal for a man about to drive 300 miles. A pound of crackling scraps from the butcher cost 3 cents in 1935. The bread itself cost almost nothing beyond that. Fed a counter full of truckers all morning from ingredients that another cook would have thrown away. That is not poor food. That is food that understood what nothing wasted actually means. Number 13, potato soup for breakfast. January in Minnesota, February in Wisconsin. The kind of cold that gets into the cab of a truck before dawn and stays there for the first hour of driving, no matter how high the heater runs. A trucker coming off a night shift at 4 a.m. in that kind of cold did not want eggs. He did not want toast. He wanted something hot in a bowl, something that warmed from the inside out and stayed warm. Diner keepers along the northern truck routes understood this without being told. Leftover potato soup from the night before, thick with cream, salt pork, onion, sometimes a scrape of cheddar melted through, went back on the burner at 3 a.m., brought up slow so it didn't scorch, and sat ready for the first man through the door. Served with a slab of white bread to push through the bottom of the bowl. This was not on the menu because there was no menu situation for this. This was a cook reading a room, reading a man, and knowing before he sat down what he needed. Nothing was announced. The bowl arrived, the bread arrived, the coffee arrived. The man ate in silence and drove on. Nothing was wasted. In these diners, nothing was ever wasted. Anchor Point 2. In 1973, the United States Department of Agriculture conducted a nutritional study specifically focused on long-haul trucker diets. The findings were not complicated. Men eating traditional high-fat, high-protein breakfasts before 6 a.m., the kind that had been served in roadside diners for 30 years, maintained stable blood glucose for 6 to 8 hours on average. Sustained energy, fewer crashes. The study noted specifically that truckers who had transitioned to packaged convenience foods and fast food reported significantly higher rates of mid-route fatigue and alertness problems. That study was not widely distributed. It did not run in newspapers. It did not appear in trucking industry publications. It was filed, and it stayed filed. By 1980, Kellogg's had a $34 million advertising contract positioning cereal, light, fast-digesting, low-fat, low-protein cereal, as the modern working man's breakfast. The tagline implied energy. The science said otherwise. A bowl of cornflakes raises blood glucose quickly and drops it inside 90 minutes. A plate of salt pork and eggs holds it steady for 6 hours. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. They were not selling nutrition. They were selling a cheaper product at a higher margin and burying the research that said so. The men in these diners were not eating poorly. They were eating correctly. The industry just needed them to forget that. Number 12. Souse meat on toast pig's head, ears, cheeks, snout, the parts that carry the most collagen and the deepest flavor, simmered for 3, 4, sometimes 5 hours in a vinegar brine, seasoned with black pepper, bay leaf, and red pepper flake until the meat fell completely from the bone. Then pressed into a mold overnight, the natural gelatin setting around the meat into something firm and sliceable. Cold from the icebox in the morning, cut into thin slices laid flat on white toast. Carolina and Virginia truck corridor diners served this through the 1940s and into the 1960s. The men who ordered it knew exactly what it was. Nobody renamed it. Nobody presented it as something other than what it was. A trucker sat down, ordered souse, and ate it without ceremony because it was good and it cost almost nothing and it kept him going. Today we call it head cheese. Wrap it in wax paper and sell it at $30 a pound in charcuterie shops in cities where the people buying it have never heard of the diners where it was a daily counter staple. Grandma just called it souse. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 11. Fried apple rings and pork sausage. The apples had to be tart. That was not a preference. That was a requirement. Sweet apples turned to mush in the pan. Tart apples, winesap, northern spy, whatever the region grew in fall, held their shape when the heat hit them, softened at the edges while staying firm at the center, and absorbed the pork drippings they fried in without losing themselves entirely. The sausage came off the flat top first. The apple rings went into the fat left behind. 3 minutes on the first side until the edges went golden and slightly translucent. 2 minutes on the second. Plated together, sausage links alongside the rings, the fat from both pooling slightly on the plate and mixing at the edges. Appalachian diner counters in Virginia, West Virginia, and eastern Kentucky served this through the 1940s and 1960s. Sweet and savory, on the same plate, cooked in the same fat, inseparable from each other in the way that flavors become inseparable when they share a pan. The food industry spent the following decades sorting American breakfast into categories. Sweet things here, savory things there, never touching. That is not how flavor works. That is not how these women cooked. That is not progress. That is the flattening of a complete flavor tradition into something easier to manufacture, package, and sell in separate aisles. Number 10. The flat top omelette. Not folded gently with a spatula angled at 30 degrees over a nonstick pan. Not coaxed. Not French. Eggs cracked directly onto a flat top that had been running at high heat for 3 hours, the surface seasoned with the ghosts of everything that had cooked on it since midnight. Diced onions scattered over the wet eggs immediately. Not after they set, while they were still liquid, so the onion cooked into the egg rather than sitting on top of it. Then left alone for 90 seconds. Then folded once, a single hard fold with the edge of a wide spatula, and slid onto the plate before the eggs finished cooking, because they finished cooking on the plate from residual heat. 45 seconds from crack to counter. That was the standard on Route 66 truck stops through the 1940s and 1970s. The omelet was never pretty. The fold was never perfect. The edges sometimes tore. None of that mattered because the flavor was right every single time. The onion sweet from the heat, the egg slightly underdone at the center, the bottom layer carrying the dark seasoning of a well-used flat top that no amount of cleaning would ever fully remove. Speed was the point. Flavor was the accident that happened every time without fail. Number 9. Tomato gravy and biscuits. When sausage was too expensive, and in the rural South of the 1930s it often was, and in some seasons a cook simply did not have it, the solution was already in the pantry. A can of whole tomatoes, opened and crushed by hand into a hot pan where bacon fat had been warming. A spoonful of flour worked through the fat before the tomatoes went in, cooked for a minute to remove the raw taste. Then the tomatoes, the heat turned down, everything stirred together until it thickened into something that poured like gravy, but looked and tasted nothing like it. The color was brick red. The flavor was bright and slightly acidic at the front, with the fat underneath rounding it out and slowing it down. Poured over split biscuits at 4 a.m. in Piedmont diner counters across the Carolinas and Georgia, it soaked into the cut faces of the biscuit and turned them the color of sunrise. A can of tomatoes cost 5 cents in 1936. The biscuits cost almost nothing. This gravy has been almost entirely erased from modern American cooking, replaced by the standardized brown gravies that restaurant chains can make in bulk, hold all day, and reheat without quality loss. That replacement was not an improvement. That is a specific loss, a specific flavor gone. Number 8. Buckwheat pancakes. Darker than night on the plate. The color of turned earth after rain. Made from 100% buckwheat flour. No white flour blended in to soften the flavor or lighten the color. And fermented overnight with a sourdough starter that the cook had been maintaining for years, decades in some diners. The starter gave the batter a sourness that worked against the natural bitterness of the buckwheat to create something complex and layered that required no syrup to make sense, though sorghum was usually available at the end of the counter. These were not sweet breakfast cakes. They were not meant to be enjoyed the way a child enjoys a stack of buttermilk pancakes. They were fuel discs, dense, slow digesting, with a protein and fiber content that kept a man running until mid-afternoon without a second thought about food. Northern Appalachian and Pennsylvania diner counters served them through the 1940s and 1960s for 8 cents a stack of 4. International House of Pancakes opened its first franchise location in 1958 and spent the following decade and $100 million in advertising teaching America that pancakes should be white, sweet, tall, and light. They knew precisely what they were replacing. They just needed you to forget it first. Number 7. Fried bologna and egg sandwich. This requires a specific correction before anything else. Fried bologna is not the same food as cold bologna. They share an ingredient list and nothing else. The heat transforms the thing entirely. A thick slice, not thin, never thin, cut a full quarter-inch from a whole chub laid onto a flat top running medium-high and left alone until the edges begin to curl upward like a bowl. That curl is the sign. The center has begun to blister. The fat is rendering out and pooling in the depression formed by the curled edges. One egg cracked directly into that pool, the white setting in the rendered fat, the yolk sitting high. Cook together until the white is done and the yolk is still soft. Slid as one unit onto white bread with a scrape of yellow mustard if the diner had it. This was a nationwide diner staple from the 1950s through the 1970s. Working men ordered it without looking up. It cost a dime, sometimes 12 cents. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. They kept the cold bologna on grocery shelves and let the technique for frying it correctly disappear from common knowledge. The product survived, the method didn't. And without the method, the product is a completely different and lesser thing. Number 6. Sorghum and butter, not maple syrup, not honey. Not pancake syrup made from high fructose corn syrup and artificial maple flavoring, which is what most Americans have been eating since the 1970s without fully registering the substitution. Sorghum, dark, slightly bitter, iron-rich molasses pressed from sorghum cane, a crop that southern and border state farmers had grown continuously since before the Civil War because it thrived in soil too poor for almost anything else. In Tennessee, Kentucky, and Missouri diners of the 1940s and 1950s, a jar of sorghums sat at the end of the counter like a permanent condiment. A trucker tore white bread into pieces, dragged each piece through a pool of sorghum and soft butter, and ate it between bites of everything else on his plate, between the salt pork and the eggs, between the biscuits and the gravy, not as dessert, as part of the meal. A palate cleanser that cost nearly nothing and delivered more iron per tablespoon than most cuts of meat. Nobody called it nutrient-dense. Nobody called it anything except good. Number 5. Grits with pot liquor poured over. Not cheese grits. Not the shrimp and grits that appears on brunch menus in southern cities at $24 a plate. Not quick grits from a cardboard canister. Stone-ground grits. Coarse, slow, requiring 40 minutes of stirring over low heat and constant attention. Cooked plain with salt and water until they reach the consistency of thick porridge, then poured into a bowl. And then the pot liquor. The dark liquid left in the bottom of the pot after last night's collard greens or turnip greens had cooked down for 2 hours with a piece of salt pork and a handful of black pepper. Not discarded, never discarded. Ladled directly over the grits in the bowl until it soaked down through and turned the whole surface dark. Deep South diner counters in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi served this through the 1940s and 1960s. The pot liquor was free. It was what would have left in the sink. Every vitamin the greens had surrendered during cooking, iron, calcium, folate, vitamin K, lived in that liquid. Nutritionists at Tuskegee University documented this in the 1930s. The cooks in these diners didn't need a study. They already knew. They just called it not throwing away good food. That is not a poor man's meal. That is a genius's meal. Those are not the same thing. Number 4. 2 eggs and crackers. When toast cost extra. And in roadside New England and mid-Atlantic diners of the 1930s and early 1940s, sometimes it genuinely did. Sometimes a man was 3 cents short. There was an unwritten agreement that operated in every diner that took working people seriously. The crackers came with the plate. Oyster crackers in a small bowl, or saltines in a paper sleeve, set down alongside the eggs without being asked for and without being charged for. It was the unwritten code. Nobody announced it. Nobody posted it. It was simply understood between the person behind the counter and the person on the stool. A trucker short on a long haul could order 2 eggs any style, over easy, scrambled, whatever, crack a handful of oyster crackers directly into the broken yolk, mix everything together on the plate, and have a complete and sustaining meal for less than 15 cents. The crackers absorbed the fat carried the salt, the egg carried the protein. Nothing was missing. There was an understanding in these diners that food was not a thing to squeeze, that a working man had enough squeezing him already. Number 3. Liver and onions at breakfast, not dinner. In Midwestern truck stop diners across Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas through the 1940s and into the 1960s, Calf liver appeared on the flat top at 4 a.m. alongside the eggs and the salt pork and the hash. Sliced thin, a quarter-inch, no more, laid onto a hot grease surface and cooked fast. Liver dies on slow heat. It toughens, turns grainy, becomes something difficult and gray. On high heat for 90 seconds per side with a heavy layer of caramelized onion built alongside it, it stayed tender at the center and developed a dark, slightly crisp exterior that carried the sweetness of the onion into every bite. Truckers on long hauls ordered it. They didn't order it because a nutritionist told them to. They ordered it because something in them, in their bodies, in their accumulated experience of long roads and early mornings and days when they needed to stay sharp through 6 states, told them that this particular food kept them right. They were correct. One serving of calf liver provides a complete daily supply of vitamin B12, vitamin A, iron, and folate. The mental clarity that comes from adequate B12 is measurable and fast. They knew things about food that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. They just called it breakfast. Number 2, black coffee and last night's pie. Every diner had one. It was not a policy. It was not a promotion. It was simply what happened to the pie that hadn't sold by closing. Whatever had been made that day, fruit pie, custard pie, cream pie, whatever the cook had assembled from what was available, sat under a glass dome at the end of the counter when the diner locked up for the night. At 4 a.m., when the first trucker came through the door before the breakfast rush, the last slice came out, cold, still in the tin, slid across the counter with the coffee, a nickel, sometimes a dime. Sometimes nothing was said about price at all. The slice just appeared, and the understanding was mutual. Nothing was thrown away. The pie was always yesterday's pie, and it was always exactly right, because cold pie with black coffee at 4 a.m. is not a dessert and not a treat and not a luxury. It is a cook saying, I made this yesterday with my hands, and it is still good, and it belongs to whoever needs it this morning. That was the whole philosophy, not just of the pie, of all of it. Every item on every counter in every diner on every route from 1940 to 1975. What I made is still good. It belongs to whoever needs it. Number 1, the trucker's special. It had no recipe. Not because no one had written it down, because it was not the kind of thing that could be written down. It changed every morning, because the ingredients changed every morning. Whatever remained on the flat top at 4 a.m., potatoes that hadn't sold the night before, a scrape of sausage, from the bottom of the pan, half a white onion sitting on the cutting board since yesterday, 2 eggs if there were 2 eggs, 1 if there was one, a handful of green pepper if the cook had bought too many, came together under a wide spatula into something that looked like it was being improvised and tasted like it had been planned for days. Every diner on every route called it the special. The trucker ordered it without asking what was in it, because it did not matter what was in it. What mattered was the agreement underneath it, that a man who had been driving alone through the dark for 6 or 8 or 10 hours could sit down at a counter and someone would feed him from what was real and what was left and what was still good. No waste, no theater, no laminated photograph of what the food was supposed to look like. Just the flat top, just the spatula, just whatever was true that morning. That was the whole agreement. That was America before it forgot how to make one. Closing these men are old now, the ones who are still here. They remember the bell above the door, that rattle, not a ring. They remember the smell of lard on a flat top at 4 a.m. and coffee that had been on the burner since midnight turning dark and slightly bitter the way coffee does when it has been kept honest for a long time. They remember ordering without a menu and eating without ceremony and leaving a quarter on a formica counter and meaning everything with it. The women who cooked for them knew things. They knew how to feed a working man from almost nothing and send him back into the dark with enough in him to make it through to the next state line. They knew that pot liquor was not waste. It was the most nutritious thing on the table. They knew that cornmeal, mush sliced cold and fried in lard, was not poverty, it was precision. They knew that the last slice of pie belonged to whoever walked through the door first at 4 a.m. These were not accidents of poverty. This was not improvisation born from desperation. This was a complete and functioning food intelligence built over generations by women whose names are not recorded anywhere. Howard Johnson's got the rest stops. Kellogg's got the breakfast table. McDonald's got the exit ramps. And somewhere between 1956 and 1975, the flat top went cold in 10,000 diners that the highway contract said you couldn't reach anymore. That is not progress. That is a theft so complete and so deliberate that most people don't even know what was taken from them. Fry the bologna this week. Make the red-eye gravy. Cook the cornmeal mush the night before and slice it cold in the morning. Do one. Just one. And comment below. Tell me which one your grandfather ordered. Tell me the name of the diner. Tell me the road it sat on, because those names deserve to be said out loud at least one more time.